Live Alive is a game that I had somehow never heard of prior to its remake announcement, despite being a big fan of classic RPGs in this style. Up to that point, its reputation in the West was pretty much non-existent, because until then it was exclusive to Japan. Some dedicated fans put together an unofficial translated version of the Super Famicom original from 1994, but it wasn't until last year when Western markets finally received an official localization. I've been interested in the game ever since that remake announcement, but I only just got around to playing it now. After having finished the game, I can honestly say I wish I hadn't put it off. Even nearly 30 years after its original release, Live Alive remains a unique and inventive twist on many JRPG tropes that continues to surprise in ways that most other games wouldn't even dare attempt. The main concept that sets this game apart from other JRPGs is how instead of telling one continuous story across an extended playthrough, it's split into several different chapters, most around 2 to 3 hours long, that each tell their own individual story. This alone changes a lot, as such a core point of the genre is character progression across an entire game. When you only have a few hours with a playable character, sometimes even less, that sense of progression can be extremely difficult to replicate. It gets even stranger though, because in addition to each chapter containing a unique story, each of those stories is in a completely different time period with a unique gameplay style. From the outset, it almost seems like the game is a collection of 7 mini RPGs rather than one cohesive experience. It is a reasonable assumption, but the game ultimately proves itself to be much more than the expectations it sets for itself. I'm getting way ahead of myself though. Before I get to any of that, I want to run through my entire Live Alive playthrough experience. I'll go through each of the chapters in the order that I played them, trace how my thoughts around the game developed, and finally return to explain the full scope of the game. If it's not obvious from my tone, I am really fond of this game. I'd even go as far to say that I loved it. But there's also a decent amount of flaws in its execution that I think are important to mention. So let's start from the very beginning with the chapter select screen. You'll immediately notice upon starting a new game that you can pick any chapter you want to start with, and throughout the whole game you're never locked into any specific order. You're allowed to go through these 7 available chapters in whatever order interests you, and while that eventually becomes a great strength of the game, I feel it's also one of the biggest factors behind why it can be such a tough sell to new players. I'll elaborate more on this later, but let me start by telling you about my first experience with the game through the Wild West chapter. The first thing that immediately struck me were the visuals, because oh my god, this game is absolutely gorgeous. It uses the HD 2D style that Square Enix initially created for Octopath Traveler, and it looks absolutely beautiful. Despite what a name like HD 2D implies, the game's visuals are actually mostly 3D, but almost all of the textures are styled off of pixel art from classic games, especially from the 16-bit era. And this is the first HD 2D game to be a remake, so there's an original to compare it to, and going back to that now just hammers home how incredible this visual style is. In fact, every aspect of the presentation here is equally fantastic. The soundtrack is another huge standout. While the visuals of the original weren't exactly groundbreaking, even for the time, the soundtrack of the original game has always been amazing. It was composed by Yoko Shimomura in one of her first soundtracks with Square, and she would eventually become much more known for her work on Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy XV, but you can see an earlier example of her work here through Live Alive. It really lives up to her high reputation. There are so many great standout tracks. I'll point out a few as we go. You've already heard the main theme of the game in the intro to this video, which is one of the best tracks in my opinion. Each era has a very distinct musical identity too, and each of them are really good. The last aspect of the presentation I want to touch on here is the voice acting. It definitely threw me for a loop. I didn't realize the game would have any voice acting at all because I'm so used to playing sprite-based RPGs like this with no voices and only text. But it didn't take me long at all to get used to it here. That's mainly because of how great the acting is. It's way better than anything I would usually expect from this kind of game. Every performance is extremely natural, emotion feels completely authentic, and the diverse dialects you'll encounter across the game go a long way into immersing you into each of these worlds even more. Anyways, back to the Wild West chapter itself, I was definitely interested in what I was playing, but it didn't take me long to realize that I had picked a very inappropriate starting point. For one thing, there's no traditional XP system, and the only battles you'll face are the few scripted story encounters. That makes for 4 in the entire chapter, 3 of which are pathetically easy and 1 of which is a boss fight. For most of the chapter, you're just running around this town on a real-time clock, collecting materials to make traps in preparation for a raid. It's fun for the first half, but then once you've collected all the materials, it kinda just turns into you standing around waiting for the boss fight. Thankfully though, it's one of the shorter chapters at under 2 hours, so it definitely doesn't feel like it overstays its welcome. This material collecting section actually did get me pretty immediately familiar with one of the mechanics that's new to the Switch remake, and that's the minimap. This is a pretty minor quality of life feature, but it genuinely can go such a long way for a game like this. I can't even count the amount of times I would have been lost without the ability to follow the orange crystal here. It is a lifesaver at points. It's not quite perfect because of the lack of detail, so sometimes the objective marker is completely off screen, and sometimes it just disappears entirely without any explanation, but it's most of the way there, and I ultimately found it to be a great convenience that I will miss the next time I play an RPG without it. Anyway, once I finally did reach that boss fight, it ended up being my first real chance to engage with the combat. The combat is pretty much the one constant throughout each of the chapters. The gameplay system surrounding it may be different, but the combat will always be the same. It's pretty crucial to enjoying the game, so thankfully I was immediately on board with it. The main concept here that sets it apart from most other RPGs is that all the characters are on a grid, so you're constantly moving your characters around. Every attack is dependent on your position relative to the enemy, so you'll have to keep that in mind, but you'll also have to consider the reach of your enemy's attacks so you can avoid those. The direction an enemy is facing can also be extremely important, so being able to manipulate their position is key to victory sometimes. Another important aspect at play here is how while the game is turn-based, every action takes up time in battle. Some actions such as moving around the grid are super short, while certain powerful attacks can take quite some time to cast. This battle system made every single encounter feel like a mini tactics battle, and I honestly loved it. The timing system was a lot of fun to learn the intricacies of, especially when it came to being able to interrupt enemy attacks or bait them into wasting turns. In that sense, it really reminded me a lot of Final Fantasy X, which is a very good thing. That's one of my favorite games. There's a lot going on with the combat system for sure, but I was always surprised at how easy I found it all to understand. There was never a point where I felt like I didn't have a good idea of how to succeed in the game, but the more I played, the more I understood, and the more effectively I was able to take down enemies. It's a great combat system that kept me incredibly engaged the entire game, and even though it's not a difficult game, the combat encourages so much thought and careful planning that I never felt like it was too easy at any points. Also, while I'm still here talking about the boss fight, I have to mention the boss theme that plays at the climactic fight in every chapter. It's called Megalomania, and it's a super exciting track. It's one of my favorites in the game. So after finishing the Wild West chapter, I was definitely intrigued to see what the rest of the game had to offer, but I had the feeling I had picked a pretty strange starting point because of the lack of a standard battle structure. And for this reason, I chose Prehistory next, mainly because it's the first chapter chronologically, so I figured it would be a more natural starting point. I was somewhat right about that, but there were still a few things about this chapter that caught me off guard. The first thing that I immediately noticed about Prehistory that actually really impressed me was how radically different the entire era feels. Yeah, it's all in a different location and it all looks different. I expected all of that, but it's also the first time that I got to feel the soundtrack shift to a completely different style of music than what I had just heard in the Wild West era. Above all else though, I found the decision to have Prehistory take place with absolutely no dialogue a really shocking and surprising twist, in the best way possible. RPGs are so known for having a ton of dialogue, so having a chapter with absolutely none of that was something that I really didn't expect. I also found the way they went about telling the story here really charming. The whole thing takes place before developed language existed, so all the characters essentially speak in emoticons. This caveman speak isn't enough to tell the story though, so scenes are often played out with a lot of slapstick. That's another aspect of Prehistory that really surprised me. It's really funny. I laughed more here than any other route, which is especially impressive considering that this is the one where nobody talks. Another cute detail I noticed here is that all of the equipment and move descriptions in this chapter are also told through caveman talk, so I really enjoyed looking through my character stat screens and reading all of those. So presentation-wise, I think Prehistory is pretty charming. Gameplay-wise though, well, it's definitely a lot closer to what I expected coming off of the Wild West chapter. There's standard encounters that aren't tied to the story, a more traditional experience and progression system, more party members, all of that. But I'm not gonna lie, I didn't find this chapter nearly as fun or enjoyable as the last. Most of that actually comes down to the standard encounters. Not because I wish they weren't here, but because the ones that are here are extremely unbalanced. Some of these were total cakewalks that required little to no effort, others brutal gauntlets that were completely unreasonable for my low-level team. There was no way to distinguish which kind you were going to get either, as they would show up indiscriminately in the exact same areas. Either battles here will take you seconds, or they'll last multiple minutes and you'll be at risk of dying at any given moment. It's the only point in the game where I frequently faced death, and none of it felt fair. It got to a point where I quit wasting my time with any of the encounters that I knew I wasn't properly prepared for. So I would just run rather than actually engaging, but what started happening is that without moving an inch, I would be thrust into another encounter that was significantly easier. It doesn't make any sense, and it just feels so poorly balanced as a whole. To be honest, Prehistory is my least favorite chapter in the game easily for this reason. It's not terrible, and I still found it enjoyable enough, but it feels like a really big oversight that's just impossible to ignore. And it's especially weird because, like I said earlier, I imagine lots of players starting with this one. It's a really rough first impression, and that now makes 2 for 2 on chapters that I wouldn't recommend starting with. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but I'm just going to say right now that I would not recommend starting with most of the chapters in this game. That becomes a pretty big issue when you're granted the opportunity to start wherever you want, and it can easily taint a new player's first impression of the game. I love being able to choose whatever order you want to play in, but I feel like they really should have chosen one of the more easily accessible chapters to make you play first, so that new players could be more effectively roped in while still having the freedom to choose the order of the rest of the game. So Prehistory wasn't exactly bad, but it was a bit of a disappointment. Next, I decided to go with the Edo Japan chapter, and I'm really glad that I did because this ended up being where the game finally clicked with me. First off, my biggest issue with Prehistory is completely solved. Every single encounter here is balanced and fair. And I'm also just going to go ahead and confirm that Prehistory is the only section of this game to have that issue. I'm really not sure what happened with that one specific chapter. Anyways, I found the Edo Japan chapter to be one of my favorites in the whole game because it feels like a really fun infiltration mission. The main gimmick of this chapter is the ability to go invisible, but you're not really sure what advantage that gives you at first. However, after every encounter, you're shown a kill count up to that point, so you're immediately given a degree of player freedom. Do you go through the whole palace using invisibility to carefully avoid all encounters whenever possible? Or do you go out of your way to destroy everything in your path? So playing this game far removed from its original release, this reminded me a lot of Undertale, which has a very similar morality system. But the original version of Live Alive actually predates Undertale by over 20 years, so it's really cool to look back in time and see what was likely an inspiration for that game. The morality system here isn't very in-depth, and it really just slightly changes the ending, but it does add a unique layer of depth and consideration that makes the Edo Japan chapter stand out in a really fun way. Personally, I wasn't able to succeed in a true pacifist route, but I tried to avoid enemies wherever I could get away with it, and it made for a really fun thrill at points. This one is just a great time from beginning to end. There's no snags or areas I really would want to improve. Next, I decided to check out the present day chapter. This is another one that's super unconventional, especially for an RPG like this, but I had a lot of fun with it. The whole thing is basically a huge Street Fighter homage, something that I find especially fitting with Yoko Shimomura on the soundtrack. This chapter essentially strips down every aspect of the gameplay except for the combat and creates a tightly focused boss rush. This would be fun enough on its own, but the game goes the extra mile here and implements this mechanic where you can learn any move for yourself instantly just by getting hit by it. Suddenly the battle dynamic changes. It's not just about defeating your opponent as quickly as possible anymore. Suddenly you're trying to actively learn each opponent's attack patterns and bait them into hitting you with your most powerful attacks while ensuring you have enough support to survive the damage. It makes each of these battles super fun and engaging, even more so than most boss fights throughout the rest of the game. Stripping the game down to only combat for this chapter worked so well because not only did it grant them the opportunity to make these especially dynamic battles, but it allowed the combat system as a whole a fantastic opportunity to shine. For me, it was a big push to understanding the intricacies of the system on a deeper level than I did up to that point, and I'm sure I'm far from the only person with that experience. It is a short chapter, clocking in at under an hour, but a very enjoyable one. The next chapter I did was the distant future one, and this one actually really surprised me, in both good and bad ways. The good surprise was that I actually found the story here really entertaining. I haven't really mentioned the stories in the chapters up to this point, because there's honestly very little to talk about there. They're all really simple and not really the reason you'd be playing the game. That's not the case for Distant Future, though. It's basically all a huge homage to the movie Alien, with the futuristic spaceship setting, the cargo load being a xenobiological specimen, the whole crew being woken up from cryogenic sleep, a central computer system called Mother. It's all very deliberate. Still though, Alien is a movie I really enjoy, so seeing this all play out was actually quite a bit of fun. And if you're familiar with the movie, yes, it plays out very similar to how you'd expect. It's not the kind of story you usually see in an RPG like this, and I really enjoyed it for that. The bad surprise, on the other hand, is the fact that the gameplay here consists of nothing more than roaming through hallways for over 2 hours, jumping between cutscenes until the boss fight at the very end. I was enjoying watching the story play out, but honestly, I did find myself checking my watch at points while playing this. It's not engaging, and I got bored. I want to love Distant Future, but I can't. I respect the intent behind making one of the stories focus entirely on dialogue, but it just goes on for far too long with far too little real engagement from the player. I think this should have been a shorter chapter, much more along the lines of present day. Next up is the Imperial China chapter, and while I found this one slightly flawed in execution, I still really enjoy it as a whole. The concept here is that you're playing as a Shifu training 3 disciples that make up your party. You have individual battles with each of them to train up their individual attributes, and it all feels very rewarding to transform your weak students into powerful allies. My biggest critique here comes in the fact that while you are encouraged to train up all 3 disciples, in reality only one of them will be coming with you to the climactic final battle. So really the only effective way to make it through this chapter is to train one disciple exclusively while neglecting the others. This is never communicated to you in any way, and had I not been warned about it beforehand, I probably would have found it quite frustrating. Another issue I have here is that because you really only want to train one disciple, that means that during the training phase of the chapter, you're essentially roped into doing the same fight 12 times in a row. Your disciple will level up, but the way you defeat them will be the exact same every time. It's the only part of the game where combat felt mindless to me. That being said, I actually do really like everything here outside of the training section. And the boss rush at the end is especially fun, though maybe a bit long. It's not perfect, but I still find this a really enjoyable chapter. The last chapter up for me to complete at this point was the near future, and this one surprised me with how strangely basic it was compared to the rest of the chapters. Every other chapter in the game has some notable mechanic that sets it apart from the typical JRPG expectations, and this one doesn't. There's a few mildly interesting things to note, such as the ability to read minds, or this one party member that levels up through items as opposed to the usual XP system, but nothing anywhere near as significant as previous chapters. In that sense, it's really hard to talk about Near Future in an interesting way. It's pretty fun, it clearly takes a lot of influence from the movie Akira, which I love, and the final battle in these giant mechs is really cool. But aside from that, I don't really have much to say about it. I definitely don't dislike it, but I didn't really love it either. It's kinda underwhelming. So now with all 7 main chapters out of the way, you unlock another, the Middle Ages. Now we're at the point where I can't really talk about this section of the game without bringing up major spoilers, and just trust me when I say you won't want this part ruined for you. If you're remotely interested in playing this game, skip to the timestamp on screen. I will warn you though, the final sections are crucial to my final conclusion on the game, so skipping to the end might make you feel like you're missing some information, because you are. Ready? Alright. So the Middle Ages chapter starts completely normal, almost too normal. In fact, it actually directly plays into a ton of the classic JRPG tropes that the rest of the game actively subverts. The Middle Ages setting already seems pretty deliberate in that sense, but that's furthered with the simple story about saving a princess from a Lord of Darkness, the overworld with random encounters, the typical party system that leans heavily into pre-established class archetypes. It's extremely familiar to anyone who's played a few classic RPGs. And that's especially strange given the fact that the rest of the game up to this point was anything but familiar. The one thing that seems to be somewhat out of place at a first glance is the post-battle results screen, which uses the primary color red. Every chapter up to this point uses a different color for the menus, but the red is especially striking. Still though, it's a minor enough detail that most probably won't think too much of it at first. Everything plays out pretty much as expected up until about halfway through, where you stumble across this room. And here is a statue of every single one of the final bosses you've faced in each of the other individual stories. I didn't mention it up until now, but most players had probably already connected the dots at this point that every boss's name is some variation on the name Odio. If that detail hadn't been heavily considered up to this point, it's impossible to ignore now. The climactic battle plays out, but from here things take an extremely dark turn. 2 of the party members are shockingly killed, and after the journey back to the kingdom, the protagonist Orsted is tricked into killing the king and is promptly exiled. He eventually returns to the dungeon to attempt saving the Princess Alethea again, where it's revealed that one of your old party members, Strabo, had deceived you in order to pursue his own love for her. You defeat him in battle, but Alethea is so shocked and angry over Strabo's murder that she kills herself right in front of you. In an emotional outburst, Orsted laments how, despite everything he's done up to this point, he has been hated and labeled as a demon by the entire kingdom. He sees no other option than to concede to the role he feels he has been assigned.
Renouncing former ties and titles. And in their place, I claim the Lord of Dark, Odio.
Now here's where things get really interesting. Every protagonist from each of the previous chapters is brought together through time and space because of the ending of the Middle Ages. You're thrust into a segment very reminiscent of Final Fantasy VI's World of Ruin as well as the endgame to Chrono Trigger, where you're given the task of finding all of your party members scattered across the world and finding their best equipment before taking on the true form of Odio. I find this really cool, in part because the original Live Alive predates each of those games that I just mentioned, but just like each of those sections, I could imagine this being really contentious with some players because it is kind of a hard left turn from the structure that was previously established. Personally though, I absolutely love this. It feels like a wide open sandbox in comparison to the tightly structured and paced chapters of the rest of the game, and being able to have all of these protagonists interact with each other is a ton of fun. I've heard some criticize this chapter for being grindy, but I honestly strongly disagree, especially if you seek out the extra dungeons you can do for some optional equipment. You'll be fine. I didn't have to grind at all and I made it through just fine. The final dungeon can actually play out differently depending on your actions, but I'll be describing the true ending because that's what I got. After defeating Odio, you're given a choice to kill Orsted. Deny it and walk away, and if you went through the effort to recruit every possible party member leading up to this point, they'll all be waiting for you. You're then thrown into a boss rush of every prior form of Odio before tackling his true form. This battle proceeds as normal until you're finally allowed to use every single protagonist in the game at once on the same screen, all before ultimately saving Orsted from Odio and letting him strike the definite final blow. It's a really satisfying conclusion that wouldn't have worked out nearly as well in any other game. So I really love the final chapters, and honestly they're my favorite part of the game. But as I mentioned before, they lean pretty heavily into classic JRPG tropes, something that the rest of the game purposely avoids. And at first, it made me question what the point of the whole thing was. I wondered why even bother making such a unique subversion of the whole genre for the primary portion of the game just to undermine all of it right at the end. But after letting the whole game sit for a while, I don't think this final section disqualifies anything that the game did in the main chapters. Orsted's story may begin like a typical classic RPG, but it certainly doesn't end up like one. And while it may share surface-level similarities with other games, a game without the unique structure of Live Alive would not have been able to pull off an ending like this to anywhere near the same effect. So here's what I think. Live Alive is a game that deliberately sets you up with the expectation that it's a deconstruction of the classic JRPG because of its story structure. Ultimately, that goal is completely realized. However, it goes about it in a completely different way than you would initially expect. Live Alive, despite what the game's marketing would have you believe, is not a collection of 7 disconnected stories. It is a series of vignettes that all revolve around the true main character, and that's Odio. The game is ultimately about him, and it's about how hate can corrupt and consume, even when a person is not bad at heart. The game builds up that theme through every single individual story and pays it all off at the very end. So yes, Live Alive is a deconstruction of the classic JRPG because of its story structure. But the thing that makes the game such a smart and unique work is how it's able to effectively lie to the player about what it is for 80% of its runtime before finally pulling the curtains back at the very end. And that's why this was, for the time, one of the best stories gaming had ever seen. And while I don't think it holds that title anymore, even today I would argue that it's bold, daring, and effective. Live Alive is a really special game. It's hard to summarize what makes it so truly fantastic without spoiling its final sections, and maybe that is a problem in its own right, but the game is so short for JRPG standards that I find it difficult to take too much issue with it. It may not be as well known as some of its contemporaries, but I would argue that it deserves to be remembered just as much as the other classics from this era. It isn't perfect in its execution, but it is able to do so much in such a short runtime, and the game constantly redefines itself so much that it's incredible it was able to stick a conclusive landing at all, let alone nail it as hard as it did. This is a must-play for any fan of the genre, and it's something that deserves so much more recognition than it has.